Hi, everybody. Hope you all are doing well. It's me, Sajid. Today, we're going to talk about the last 9 books that I read over the past 4 months, I suppose. They weren't the most productive reading months, I would say. I just got caught up with other things and I did not focus on reading as much as I wanted to. I did read 3 novels out of the library, and that was the extent to full-length books written in prose that I read with my eyeballs. Everything else, I think I listened to like 3 audiobooks after that, and I read like 1 poetry book, 1 graphic book, and 1 graphic/poetry book. So this is where we are right now, and we're going to be talking about all of those today. So I'm going to start off with the fiction, and I'll start off with the 3 books that I read out of the library. So the first of which is Susan Abulhawa's Mornings in Janine, which I just gushed about in my last video, which was my favorite books of 2024. I loved this book. It was an incredible story. It's following Naga, a Palestinian woman born in Kuwait to Palestinian refugee parents, growing up with her mom, her brother, her grandmother. She has a bit of a tumultuous life growing up. She gets involved in dancing, which leads her down the path of getting involved into sex work. We follow her life under Iraqi occupation of Kuwait before eventually fleeing to Amman in Jordan, and then eventually again returning to her homeland of Palestine, where she gets involved in the resistance. And we're being told all of this by her as she's sort of writing the story of her life in a high security or maximum security Israeli prison. So what we do get from this is that she did something when she went to Palestine, and the entire story is like the story of her life leading up to that event. And it is so good. It is a beautiful exploration of Palestinian resistance. The writing is fantastic. It reads like a love letter to Palestine. Everything that I said in my favorite books of the year video, this pretty much encapsulate how incredible this book was. I also went ahead and picked up Disorientation by Elaine Chou, which I did talk about in my favorite books as well. This was another fantastic read, a very funny, satirical kind of spin on academia, and a really smart commentary on the treatment of and the fetishization of East Asian people in academia. It's about this 29-year-old PhD student who's stuck in this PhD program. She's doing her thesis on a very famous Chinese-American poet who's not real, but real in the context of the story. And she comes across some stuff about him in the archive that she finds useful, that she could, potentially help her make her arguments so that she could finish her thesis. And then she discovers more as she goes down the rabbit hole, and it completely deconstructs everything that she's doing. It ends up being a fascinating commentary on politics, on like leftist versus liberal versus left-leaning versus right-wing politics. It's a fascinating commentary and discussion and exploration of the ways in which white academics prey on non-white, non-Western cultures and essentially build careers off of them, and the ways in which people who are actually from those cultures are treated in that sense. And it's so good. It's very satirical. It's definitely something that you have to suspend your disbelief while reading, but it is such a rewarding read, and everybody should read this book. I also read a popular book that I didn't really love, and it's one of those books that so many people have been recommending to me this year. It's On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous by Vuong. This book has been recommended over and over and over by people to me. It's one of those books that kind of stretched beyond just the bookish community, like people who don't read that much or may read like a few books a year, or who may not necessarily read literary work, have been reading this book. And I understand why. It's a beautiful story. It's very accessible as well. But it didn't really work for me. It is a story about this Vietnamese boy named Little Dog it's essentially a letter to his mother. So the whole book is written as like a letter to his mother, and he's writing to his mother because he doesn't actually believe she will read it. And so it's about him sort of like, pouring his heart out talking about his complicated relationship with her, which is defined by both love and abuse. And that intersection is something that I really appreciated, the ways in which the author explored that with a lot of nuance. I also appreciated the ways in which the book kind of like broke form and got really experimental. It got very poetic at times, which, as I said, I appreciate, but that kind of stuff doesn't really work for me. So there's another thing about the book that just didn't hit, I guess. It's also a fabulous exploration of queer identity. A lot of the tension between the main character and his mother has to do with his queerness and coming into terms with his queerness. In many ways, this is a coming-of-age story, but it's also a story about the history of what happened in Vietnam, how it caused his family to flee to the United States, and what that trauma has done to the family. And it's a good book, again, but just something about it just didn't really click with me. And I don't know, like, whilst reading it, I felt like I was kind of forcing myself to finish it. It felt like a bit of a chore after a while, which it really shouldn't have, because it's a very short book and a really easy to read. But I just, up till this day, I can't put my finger on why I didn't love this book as much as I felt like I should have. And I also almost kind of felt the same way, not almost, I mostly felt the same way about If an Egyptian Cannot Speak English by Noor Naga, which was, this was one that I listened to on audio, so it was narrated by the author herself as well as Amin El-Ramal, but it's basically a story that takes place between two perspectives. So we follow a female character and a male character. They're both Egyptian. The boy is from Shubrahit, which is a village in Egypt, and the girl is from the United States. She's born in the US to Egyptian parents, so she's returning to Egypt for the first time. And it's a story about like diasporic identity versus like homeland identity, the difference and the rift between those two things. But it's ultimately also a story about an abusive relationship, because these two people get together and immediately the male character is controlling and abusive in ways that don't seem very clear to the female character, and only starts to become clearer as the story progresses. The book is very airy-fairy and not super like detailed and stuff. It's almost like I listened to it, so I can't really like imagine how it was written on the page, but it felt very poetic. It felt very, I don't know what's the word, a little loose. Like, it didn't feel like a very tightly woven together prose story, and it was not meant to be that. I was not loving it throughout, and I was feeling kind of the same way that I was feeling when I read On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous. And I guess what is the reason why I didn't really like both of these books, it might have something to do with the fact that I think right now in my life, I like stories that just feel a lot more fleshed out, where a lot more is happening, where it's a lot more descriptive and grounded, where the plot is more complex and interesting, where we have more and more characters. I think I just need like bigger stories right now. I think I'm just at a place in my life where that is the kind of storytelling that I prefer, because usually I vibe with these kinds of books, but it wasn't the case this time around. What saved this book for me was the third part. The third part of the book is really interesting. It gets very meta, to say the least, and kind of addresses a lot of the issues that I was having with the book, almost as though as if the author herself wanted you to have those issues with the book, for them to be kind of deconstructed right in front of you in the third part. And so I appreciated that. I think that kind of saved the story for me. But overall, it wasn't like the best book I've read. I guess I'll talk briefly about the graphic stuff and the poetry stuff that I read. We'll start with poetry first. I read Narcissus by Andre Bagoo. This is This is a poetry collection by a local author who I've met. He actually gave me this book, signed it almost 2 years ago actually, along with his short story collection book, The Dreaming, which I loved. Narcissus is a collection of poems about queer identity, about the body, about nature, as it intersects with a Caribbean identity or Trinidadian identity. It toys a lot with the imagery from the myth of Narcissus, which is one of those Greek mythology things. I don't know anything about Greek mythology, but basically what I know about this story is that there was this god or demigod, and his name was Narcissus, and he fell in love with his own reflection, and that ended up being his own undoing. And so the book actually has a lot of, the poems in here have a lot of like reference to reflection and water and those types of things. And it's also sort of about, it's kind of making connections with gay male identity in a way, because of there's this thing that exists within gay male culture of like not just mask for mask, but this sort of falling in love with somebody that looks like you, or wanting to be or wanting to look like the very same thing that you're attracted to and that you want to be with, if that makes sense, which is something that I think a lot of like queer men are like subsumed by, like the image of like the perfect body and what's good looking and what is attractive, wanting to be that and wanting to be with it at the same time, and how that ends up being like people's own demise, similar to the Narcissus myth. It's really interesting. At least that's what I gleaned from it. Like, what I should say is that I don't get poetry, and I didn't get most of this because I'm not a poetry person. But I did appreciate what I could take out of it. And Andre, if you appreciate this, it gets very experimental with form and stuff. Like look at this. This is a circle. Like, it's very it's okay if you like poetry. I'm not smart enough for that. Sea Prayer, Khaled Hosseini. This is also poetry, but it's also graphic at the same time, so it's like watercolor images along with poetry, or like, I don't know if you'd call that poetry or just like lines of words. It's okay. It's basically about a family that's fleeing Syria, and it is told from the perspective of a parent or a father to a young boy before they are about to flee Syria, with the understanding that, while it doesn't end up happening in the story, with the understanding that he is going to die on the journey, the young boy, because it's actually based off of a true story, Elaine, who passed away on the journey from Syria trying to flee to Europe in 2015. So while I was reading the book, I wasn't necessarily like moved by it, but when I read that ending part that said it was based off of a true story where this happened, it's good. Khaled Hosseini, illustrated by Dan Williams. It's a quick read. You'll read it in 10 minutes and give it a try if it's something you're interested in. Genderqueer, Maia Kobabe. This is a memoir about the author's life coming into their own queerness and queer identity, but specifically gender queerness. And so the book is about their life growing up when they are young first, and then coming into adulthood, and really sort of figuring out what their identity is. The art is pretty cute. The book is just kind of like every other couple of pages or so is like a new story or anecdote from their life, so it doesn't feel like this continuous arc. It was okay. Highly recommend that you read it. I really enjoyed it. Love a good graphic novel and a graphic memoir. Last two books I read were audiobooks that I listened to. I listened to Follow the Rabbitproof Fence, which is really hard to say. Like, try saying that 5 times fast. This is written by Nugi Garimara, and the audiobook was read by Rachel Maza. It's a book that takes place in Australia, kind of in the 30s, and it's a non-fiction book because it's based on the author's mother and her 2 sisters' childhood. And these 3 young girls basically were kidnapped from their Aboriginal community in Australia by, the colonizers, the settlers. And they took them down to a reservation camp, or it was more like a reservation school thing, similar to like what happened in the United States, but it was particularly targeting half-caste children. So these 3 young girls were half white, half Aboriginal. So they were taken from their homes in a village or a town called Jigalong, which is in Western Australia, like Western, slightly northern, but not quite north, not quite to the coast. Australia, still very much inland, and taken, I think it was southwards to a new like school or something. They run away from that school and they end up following a rabbit-proof fence that led them back home, essentially. And so this is the story of that happening, but that's really like the latter half of the book. The first half of the book is kind of like building up the context to Aboriginal Australia. Not Aboriginal Australia, sorry, to the colonization of Aboriginal Australia and to the destabilization of Indigenous life in Australia. And it was really good. Like, that first half of the book I really enjoyed. I also really enjoyed the second half where we get to explore the girls and stuff. But to be quite frank, like, by the time I got there, the book was kind of going over my head because, again, I listened to it and there were just like a lot of details and a lot of things happening that I didn't quite like, hang on to as I was listening. But I still really liked it, and I think if you want to get a little bit more or learn a little bit more about like Indigenous history or Aboriginal history in Australia, I think this is a really good book. From what I understand, it was made into a movie as well, so I may have to check that out too. And the last book I listened to was I Survived Capitalism, and all I got was this Lousy t-shirt by Madeline Pendleton. Madeline Pendleton is a TikToker. She makes videos about like mostly politics and communism and left-wing politics. She's seen as somewhat controversial because of her political views, though I do not find her political views to be controversial or bad at all. I actually really resonate with a lot of the things that she says. She also has a podcast, I believe, which I don't know what it's called. I haven't listened to it as yet. And then she is also quite known for being the owner of a company of a clothing brand called Tunnel Vision, which she quite famously runs on a socialist model. So basically all of her employees get equal pay, including her. Like, she gets the same pay as her employees. And she talks about that in the book as well. So the book itself, I should say, is Madeline is very how to put it, because she's communist and left-wing, but also very interested in finance and money. She kind of intersects that in this book, and she talks about her life growing up in poverty in Fresno, California, and how that led to her being disenchanted, how that led to her own form of class consciousness, and how she survived capitalism. So how do you negotiate with and try to live under a system and be comfortable under a system that you directly oppose? So that's kind of what the book is about. Going into this, I was a little bit nervous because I thought it was going to just be like a capitalism survival guide, which is only part of what it is. It's mostly a memoir. And that is what I enjoyed the most about this book. I really enjoyed learning about her life growing up, how she came to be the person that she is. There were some really sad parts of the book, like she had a partner who she really loved that committed suicide, so she talks about that quite a bit in the book. And she talks about all sorts of other things. It was really interesting learning a little bit more about like life in California, sort of demystifying what that looks like. And I thought it was a poignant critique of the United States, the economic and political system over there. And I thought it was a necessary read or a necessary listen in that regard. At the end of each chapter, she does like a little bit on surviving capitalism, like tips and tricks. So that's where the guide comes in. So let's say she has a chapter on her story of how she came to buy her house. The survival guide section or bit at the end of the chapter would be basically about like, okay, how to buy a house and how to do it in a way that is sustainable or affordable, etc., etc. Those parts of the book were interesting. I did find some of the tips to be quite helpful, but and this is also kind of the reason why I wasn't looking forward to reading the book so much, because I thought that this was the whole thing about the book. But some of the things that she said were either I found to be like general tips. It's not to say that the tips weren't useful, and it wasn't useful to hear it coming from her perspective, but like it just felt like general tips. Like if you Googled how to do a resume, how to buy a house, how to whatever. I guess the tips that she gives are unique to her in some ways, but it didn't feel like she said anything like, oh, I never thought about it that way. But some of them were quite useful, because sometimes you just need the reminder. You just need somebody to kind of remind you, like, hey, this is how you need to approach doing this thing as an adult. Like, it sucks, but here's some advice from me. So I'm not saying that the advice wasn't useful. It just didn't feel like, oh my god, this is life-changing or mind-boggling. And the other thing about it is that a lot of what she said was very relevant to being from America and the American political and economic system, which is fine because she's American and she's coming from an American experience. But there were certain things about like the tips that she was giving at certain points in time that I guess just don't really apply to me or aren't really relevant to my life. That's going to be it for this video. Thank you for watching. If you read any of these books and you have any thoughts on them, please let me know in the comments down below. All of that being said, thank you so much for watching. I hope you have a lovely, lovely day. And until next time, inshallah, keep reading.